Would you like to excel at Excel? If so, I hope you'll join me as we continue to work on our personal finance budget worksheet and learn about many Excel features in the process. In this video, we're going to discuss the concept of creating cells with our inputs or parameterizing our worksheet. Essentially, we want to avoid hard coding values in Excel as much as possible. And this concept of sometimes it's called using parameters also applies to analytical coding, but we'll see that in Excel today. We'll talk about how you can expand the width of columns either automatically or manually. We'll talk about how you can highlight cells in different colors. We'll also talk about how you can copy and paste cell formatting and how you can link cells together through Excel formulas. We'll talk about how you can choose your text alignment for cells and how you can make sure columns have the same width across a range of columns. We'll go over some different cell calculations and several different types of formatting you can apply to cells. We'll discuss locking cell references in your formulas and even adding lines underneath cells and putting borders around cells as well. If that sounds good to you, let's head over to Excel. And now I want to lay out some parameters that are going to, high-level parameters that are going to impact our entire budget. I'm going to lay those out at the top of the code or the worksheet. But this principle of laying out parameters at the top of our Excel workbook that then update everything else, it also applies to other analytics tools as well, like setting parameters in SQL or setting variables in Python, which we'll get into later on in this sessions. But let's set some parameters in Excel. So the first one we're going to set is our starting savings balance. Where were we at the beginning of the year? I'll make a row for that. We also need to set some kind of assumed interest rate or return rate. Rate of return would perhaps be a better word for it. Rate of return on savings. So I'll have a parameter for that. We also might want to make an assumption around salary growth. Certainly cannot be certain on what that's going to be, but we can make some reasonable assumptions, bake that into our model. We also need to consider what our tax rate is, and also what we have a line for giving. What's our giving going to be as a percentage of our income, so giving percentage. And we might want to think about for our expenses, we have an assumed salary growth. There could also, one reason why salaries generally increase is due to inflation, and that means our expenses might also go up. Certain expenses might go up over time, and so that can look different for each expense category, of course, but we will also try to bake in a general expense inflation rate as well, make some assumptions around that. So we have 6 different parameters that we're going to set at the top, so that if we want to make some assumptions and see how our budget would change if we experience a different inflation rate or a different rate of return on our savings, how that would impact our savings goals. All right, well, let's make some assumptions here. Let's say our starting savings balance is $50,000, and you can customize this as you wish. Let's say our rate of return on savings that we're going to assume for the next few years is, we'll say, 4%. Adapt that to whatever your expectations are. Salary growth, 3% is a common number. Again, feel free to change these. Let's say that tax rate's going to depend on your income bracket, of course, but let's say our taxes, and this I guess would represent your national and state taxes, all of your anything applied to your income, including Social Security and those types of payroll taxes as well. Let's say it's 20% here, so we'll use that, and let's say we want to give 10% of our income, and let's set the inflation rate at say 4%. Feel free to adapt those as you wish. Now, what you'll notice here is all the cells are equal width. All the columns are equal width by default. But one problem with that is the default is cutting off some of our titles here. Even down here, it seems to, it naturally flows into the next cell, but if the next cell is populated, it'll get cut off as it is here with our starting savings balance. So one option would be to say, oh, I want to expand that and kind of do that manually as I am right there. But another option, probably a better option, a quicker option, is to simply double click on the right side of that column's letter at the top. So right here, you can see as soon as I hover on that edge, the mouse changes a little bit. I'm going to double click on the right edge of B in this case, and it automatically expands the column width to the longest number of characters in that particular column. In this case, it kind of managed to the rate of return of savings, and you can see added in a little extra there at the end, and you can adjust it from there if you wanted to manually. So that's a neat time saver, time trick. Now, I'm also noticing here that the alignment is a little different. So Excel by default aligned everything to the right, which is fine. In this case, I might want to align everything to the left. So I can do this one at a time by highlighting a cell and then clicking the align left button here. Or I can highlight multiple cells at the same time and apply this to everything. And now everything's left aligned. So that's a little more efficient, is to highlight all the cells that you want to apply an operation to. Another example of that, it's good to use highlighting, not too often, not for no purpose at all, but strategically. And in this case, I want to highlight the parameters that could be updated that will update the rest of the budget. And so in this case, those are all up here. And so I'm going to highlight all of these. I'm going to use the same color. Some people might use different colors for certain things. Feel free to use color however it makes sense for your use case. But in this case, we can highlight everything, and there's this fill color, represents the background color of the cell. By default, it's yellow, and you could choose other colors if you wanted to, but I will use yellow in this case, or I could have just clicked here. And there you go. We've got highlighting. If we wanted to remove that, you could go to no fill, but we will highlight our cells yellow. And at this point, one more thing I wanted to add in here. I wanted to add in a starting salary assumption. And so in order to do that, I will go ahead and click on row 4. I want to insert a row above this, similar to what we did before. Right click on row 4, insert, and I will add a starting salary assumption, and we'll set that at 50,000 for our example. All right, we've got some starting parameters. Let's go into the next step and actually build out our budget. Let's build out our year-by-year budget. Well, when we build our budget, the year part will not just apply to one section. It doesn't just apply to income or expenses or our savings down here. It applies to all of those categories. And so rather than put a year into each individual category like income and expenses, let's just create one year label, and we'll do that at the very top of our budget area here. And our first year we'll start with is year 2023. I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. That looks pretty good. I might go ahead and center it here. Now, in some cases, you perhaps if these have been drugged down, we might have a different format for it. And so if that does happen to you, you might right-click on the cell, and one of the options you'll have is to format cells. So notice this is just a general format. You have currency. Obviously that wouldn't look good for a cell, but I can right-click on it again and say maybe number. Sometimes you might see this and you might look at this and say, ooh, decimals for a year, that doesn't look right. Comma separator, which is generally a great thing to separate your larger numbers with a comma for every thousands, every 3 numbers. But doesn't make sense for a year. So right click on that, format cells, and we can either go back to general, or we could use number and just simply turn off the thousand separator and reduce the number of decimals. Again, default was fine in this case, but if you do see that, that's how you can adjust formatting. Another format that you can see up here is to turn it into a percentage. Obviously that's not what we want in this case, but those are some of the more popular formats that get used, and that's how to change it. Just right click on the cell. I'm going to do Control Z to undo that change. But that's our year. So we've gotten our year, we've centered it. Now we are going to want to build a budget where we can forecast our savings and our savings balance over time. We can actually do quite a bit of planning here. So let's say that we want to extend this out for several years. Well, I could set this up where I populate 2024, and then I'm using the arrow keys here, but I could also just double click or click on any of the cells 2025. I'm doing this manually, but there's a better way. So another way to approach this is to say, well, each column I populate is simply one more than the previous cell. That's a great use case for an Excel formula. So instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is type equals, and you can see that simply overwrites what was there before. And now I can actually point to another cell. This is the beauty of Excel. I can point to this cell, and it says whatever is in this cell, that's what I want to start with. And if this cell ever changes, this cell is linked to it, and it will change too. It'll always reference whatever the value is in that cell it's pointing to. And cells are referenced based on their letter, the letter of the column, and the number of the row. So in this case, it's saying equals C12. And you can simply click on the particular cell that you want to reference. You can see the reference is updating here. But you can also just simply type in that reference if you look at it and know that. So either way works. Now in this case, we don't want it to just equal 2023. If I want to edit this, I'm going to just double click on it and it brings up the equal C12. But we want it to be whatever that year was plus 1. Great. All right, so I will drag this across, just make several years here. Maybe we'll go through let's say 2032. Now if we were said, how many years is that? A quick way to do that is to highlight. You can highlight columns, you can highlight rows, you can highlight combinations, a whole set of rows and columns. But one of the neat features here is that when you highlight rows, you get some summary statistics at the very bottom. This tells us the average among all populated values. The average here is 2028. Then it tells us the count. Now this is not the count of cells per se, but it's the count of cells with a value in it. So notice the count is currently 10. We have 10 rows represented here. What happens if I went further out? I'm highlighting more than 10 columns right now. Notice the count's still 10. That's because the count only count, and notice the average hasn't changed. It didn't factor these in as zeros or anything like that. The average, the count, the sum, they are all based on purely populated rows. So this is saying there are 10 cells that are populated. And among those 10 cells that are populated, the average is 2028. I'm going to highlight all of these, and again, similar to what we did over here with the highlighting and the justification, I'm going to, in one go, apply centering to all of them. Now in this case, I also want to have the same column width for all of those. I want to keep things as consistent as possible, and so I'm going to highlight all the columns up here, and then if I manually adjust the column width that I want, it is going to adjust all of the columns for each year so that they're all the same, whatever I've chosen. I'm just editing column C here, but I have everything highlighted, and so it'll apply that formatting to everything. And now all the columns have the same width, which is a little more aesthetically pleasing than having different column widths. All right, so that is our year breakdown that applies to income, expenses, and savings. Now another thing I want to do here is take this income section, and I might want to expand the title for this to go all the way across to all of our years. So I'm going to highlight the cell that income is currently in, and I'm going to highlight all of the columns that represent different years, highlight all of those. And this is where the merge and center option comes in. I'm just going to highlight those, come up here and click merge and center, and there you go. Now our income title goes all the way across all of our years. So that looks good. Now this is the title, and so I'm gonna maybe apply some bold formatting to it to make that title stand out even more. I might also put a border around it. Now you could use underline, which would just simply underline that text. It doesn't go all the way across. In this case, rather than do an underline that only goes for income, I want to make it clear that this applies to all of the years. And so instead of, I'm gonna just click underline, which will de-underline it in this case, and then I'm going to apply a border to it. Now you have thin borders and you have thick borders. In this case, we'll use a thick border. There we go. That looks pretty good. We can do the same thing with expenses. That's another category label, and so we will highlight all the cells here, click merge and center, click bold, click border, and there you go. It looks pretty similar. Now there's a faster way to do that. I'm going to do Control Z. You can do Control Z multiple times. That undid the border, that undid the bold, that undid the merge cells. I did Control Z 3 times there. Well, what if I said, well, I basically just want to do the same thing I just did to income. I want to apply that same formatting to expenses. One option for you, and this applies to a lot of scenarios, is to highlight the formatting that you want to apply. So I say, yeah, income looks great. If you could just take that formatting and apply it to expenses, would be great. Okay, highlight that. Click Format Painter here. And then you can see we change the border a little bit. It's kind of saying, okay, we're about to apply this formatting to whatever you click next. So after you click that Format Painter, the very next thing you need to do is click into the cell that you want to apply that formatting to. And it's the expenses cell right here. So watch what happens after I clicked Format Painter and then I click expenses. There you go. All three of those things, the merge cells, the bold, the border, it's all been applied. And so why not do that again? We can actually do it from expenses this time, or income. We're going to click on that formatting that we like, click Format Painter, click on Savings. There we go. We've quickly created some similar formatting for each of our labels. And I might put some bold on all of the years by highlighting all of them, just trying to be as efficient as possible. It's taking shape. Well, let's try to populate our first line item here, which is salary. Now our starting salary, we could just go in and say, oh, it's going to be 50,000. But we created a parameter up here for a reason. We want to simply be able to point to the starting salary up here and be able to update at the top of our workbook, and then let that flow into the budget from there. So rather than what this would be called hard coding down here, we have typed in specifically 50,000, and so if we update this to be 45,000, for instance, it doesn't change here. Well, we want to be able to just change these parameters up here and have everything flow through. So instead of hard coding it here and typing the specific number, we're going to use the equal sign and point to the cell C4. In this case, we can click on it. Great. Now watch what happens if we update this to 45,000. This cell updates too. Pretty neat. Very similar to what we did here, except in this case, we're just simply pointing to that value. We're not adding one like we did for the year. All right, so let's change this back to 50,000. Cell changes. Great. 2023 is really easy. Now in 2024, again, we have assumed that we will have a salary growth each year of 3%. So an easy way of calculating that would be to say, well, what was your salary last time? We'll point to 2023 salary, and then maybe we multiply by 1.03. You get your salary last year plus 3% in the next year, 2024. That's our assumption. And that would, oh, notice what happened here. It does this hashtags, multiple hashtags. It says there's not enough room to display this. Now there's a couple ways of handling this. One would be to expand it by going up to the column letter, double clicking on the right edge. There you go, it expands it. We can see all the numbers now. So what it did here was it actually put in some decimals here, which you don't want to show decimals unless it's really necessary. We're talking about something like a salary, especially one in the thousands. Probably don't need to see the cents there. It's just too much information. We want to simplify it a little more. And so one way of doing that would be to right click on it and say format cells. Okay, reduce the number of decimal places. And there you go, we're back to where we were before. And now we might want to update our cell headers. I'll just update that there. Okay, looks good. We did inadvertently though, we did some hard coding. Sure, our salary will update if we update 45,000, great. But if we update the salary growth to be, say, 2%, this doesn't change. Why? Because we've hard-coded this salary increase of 1.03 down here. So we want that to be dynamic and to reference this salary growth assumption up here as well. Do Control Z to undo those. Okay, 50,000, 3%. So now instead of doing that, what we can do here, the multiplication sign, by the way, is this star. That's what's used for multiplication in Excel formulas. Well, I'm going to delete this 1.03. So we need it to be 1, because that represents what our baseline was, plus this 3%. So instead of putting 0.03 there, we're simply going to point to the salary growth row. And then we'll do close. So parentheses here, we need this 1 plus 0.03 in this case to be calculated before doing the multiplication. So we're using parentheses to handle the order of operations. All right, that should be good. Looks good. Now, if we update our salary growth to be a little bit lower, this number changes. So everything, and if this changes as well, similar to last time, it changes. So our salary numbers here are truly dynamically changing based on these parameters that are set at the top. That's what we want. All right, well, I guess at this point, similar to year, we can simply drag this. This is neat. You can, one way of doing this would be to right click and say copy, paste, and then maybe right click again and say copy, paste, and just kind of keep doing that. Now there is a keyboard shortcut. We can highlight something, Control C, and then you can paste it by using Control V. That's another good shortcut that works in a lot of different platforms. So either way, whether you right click on it and then right click on the cell you want to paste it in and say paste, either way we're copying, right? Now there is a quicker way to expand this though. In this case we want to do that all the way across for 8 or 9 different cells here. What you can do in Excel is simply click on the cell that you want to copy over, and you notice the cursor changes a little bit when you go to the bottom right of that cell. That's good. You want to go to the bottom right of the cell, do a left click, and then drag. You can use this to drag down or to drag to the right or left or up. So we're going to drag to the right in this case. The whole thing is copied. Great. Now this is where the good sanity check comes in. We look at it and we say, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. We're not seeing that 3% growth being applied to 2025 and beyond. It looks great for 2024, but what about 2025? One thing I like about Excel is if you double click into a cell, it'll highlight with colors what cells it's pointing to. So we can easily see, okay, it's pointing to the previous year times 1 plus 3%. That looks great. Well, what happened in 2025? Let's double click there. Okay, pointing to 51,500 from 2024. That makes sense. 1 plus D5. Wait a minute. That's blank. I don't want it to point to D5. I want it to point to C5. This is where locking cells comes in. So a way to, before we drag the formula over, in some cases, maybe you did have a different assumption for 2024. So maybe you said, yeah, 2024 salary growth there, I'm thinking 4%, and then maybe 2% after that. I'm going to, get promoted in 2026, and then, I'm going to do 3% after that. And now you actually have dynamic, a different salary growth for each year. So maybe you have some assumptions around this, and this is a good model for you. But in our assumption, we're going to have a simple assumption that just on average your salary growth is 3%. Okay. So in that case, we need to lock cells. So let's go into, before we drag in this, I'm going to highlight this and just click the delete button. That'll remove everything. Before I drag the formula, I need to lock any of the cells that I want to. Now, the 50,000 here, we do want that to always be the cell to the left. So that looked great. There's no locking necessary there. But we do for C5 here, you can lock the number, which would represent the row, or you can lock the column. In this case, it's shifting the column as we drag the formula to other columns. So we need to lock in the formula. We need to say we always want it to be column C, even if we've drug over to other columns. So let's do that. To do that, to lock either a column or a row, you simply put a $sign. And you can do that before the column, which locks in the column. And if you wanted to lock the row, you can do one or the other or both. You can put a $sign before the row number. In this case, we just want to lock in the column number C. So we've done that. We put the $sign in there. Watch what happens now when we go to the bottom right of the cell, drag it over. Okay, it's looking a little better. And we can see why if we double click, I'll double click on a different cell this time, it's still referencing the 3%. It doesn't keep shifting to the right because we put that $sign there. Now we wanted it to reference the most recent salary. We wanted that to kind of dynamically shift. If we go to 2030, it's referencing 2029. And so we didn't put the $sign in front of that so that it would drag over with it. Hopefully that does a good job of illustrating the difference there between locking formulas and not locking formulas. All right, we've got our salary populated. Now let's populate our return on savings that we expect for the next several years. We'll start with the first cell, and I'm going to go ahead and double click in there. Now this first cell is unique because we're not going to be referencing any kind of ending savings balance at the bottom of the sheet that would have been calculated. We will reference, at least for this first 2023 return on savings, what our starting savings balance was, the parameter that we enter at the top. So reference that, and then we're going to multiply that by our expected rate of return on savings, which is the 4% here. All dynamically so that if we update these later, it'll automatically update for our return on savings row. There we go, expecting $2,000 return, 4% of the $50,000 in 2023. Now for 2024 and beyond, our return on savings will be a function of not the starting savings balance for 2023, but whatever our ending savings balance was from the prior year, which will be represented in this row eventually. So we're going to point to prior year, 2023, C34 in this case, and we're going to multiply that by our rate of return on savings. Now let's not make the same mistake we did last time where we calculate that, we drag it over, and notice unless we wanted to populate a unique rate of return on savings for every single year, we need to lock in at least the rate of return on savings. Now, similar to what happened with salary, we do always want it to be based on the most recent year's ending savings balance. So this part, K34 column, row 34 is fine here, but we need to come in here and lock in the cell reference. Now remember, before we manually kind of hit the dollar sign to lock in the reference to column C. Another way of doing that is using, again, keyboard shortcut. If you're selected, if I'm right before C, or even here, like right before the 3, if I just hit F4, I can actually hit it multiple times, and it's going to cycle through the different combinations, locking through the column, locking in the row, or locking in both like it is right here. So that's a quick way to lock in a reference, is to highlight that, click F4. So we've done that. Now when I drag over to the right, still referencing the 4%. Now it's still 0 because we haven't populated our ending savings balance, but we will do that soon enough, and we should see these numbers update. Now they're not formatted as dollars, and they probably should be. We would want that return on savings to be in dollars. Again, we could right click on it, go into format cells, go into currency, choose this format, and do that for each one without the decimals, or use that convenient format painter option to copy the formatting to all of those cells. I'm going to highlight this row, which has the exact format we want it to be in, dollar sign in front, no decimals. Click the format painter, and it's very important that you click in the first cell where you want the copying to start, which would be for us C17 here. And there you go, we've got it updated. Now maybe we go ahead and do that for our next row, total income, which we'd also want to be in dollars with no decimal sign. Let's do that. We also would want, let's center this. So we'll do center. Yeah, some people might prefer left align, some centering. We'll center for now. Now we're wanting to do a sum of salary and return on savings to get our total income. And a very simple way to do that would be to say equals this cell, 50,000, plus the 2,000, the return on savings, and that gets us our total. So we're simply typing in a formula, and you can see we used a plus sign. Makes sense. We could use minus. We saw that you could use the star sign if you wanted to multiply, but we want to add here. That's certainly a valid way to do that. Let's see, like this. Another way though, and this will really pay off when we do our total expense calculation, is to use a function. Now functions are big in any analytics platform. They do things, and like in the one we're going to use, sum, they allow us to aggregate across multiple things, but functions do all kinds of things. In this case, instead of doing that sum operation, we'll still start off with an equal sign, but we're going to refer to a function name, and that function is going to be called sum. And a function, in a lot of platforms, but in Excel in particular, starts with the function name, open parentheses, and then as you can see here, it'll take a set of arguments. For sum, the arguments are simply the cells that you want to add up. So in one case, we have the salary, 50,000. We want to use a comma, and we want to enter all the other things that we want to sum. In this case, the 2,000 as well. We can do that. We can close parentheses that ends the function, and press enter. And now that's another way of calculating a sum. Instead of using the plus sign, we used a function name called sum that adds the cells that are separated by commas. Now again, in the expense case, this is really going to come in handy. Rather than individually selecting all of those, in Excel what we can do is actually highlight the cells in a range.
So in this case, it'd just be 2, but you could do however many cells that you needed to add. You can just highlight them all. And notice what happens here in our formula. You end up with a colon that shows from this cell to this cell, we want to select all of those. So same sum function we were using before when we used commas, but now we're using colons, a colon to select a range of cells. So that's a especially efficient way to calculate a sum. We do that. See what happens when we go to the bottom right of the cell, drag over. Looks good. I'm going to double click here. Yep, it scrolls over and adds the salary and the return on savings for that row. Now, in accounting and even in math itself, we often use an underline to denote a sum. And so let's do that in this case and make it very clear that salary and return on savings are being added to get to our total sum. And I could just go to a particular cell and highlight this border option. You can do a thick border or a thin border, but if you wanted to do it across all the cells, we can highlight all of these cells, go back to our border option, bottom border, and look at that. It's very clear that salary and return on savings are being added to get to total income. Hey, our income section is looking really good.
If you like this video, I hope you'll consider liking it formally. And if you'd like to see more analytics, data science, and leadership training videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. Finally, if you have any questions on what we discussed today, please leave a comment and I'll try to respond to it as soon as possible. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.